Welcome, everybody, to another episode of JewishRing.com, the podcast, the video. And today I'm very excited. We have Dr. Vadim Putzu, who is an assistant professor, at least at the time of the recording of this, at Missouri State University. Go Bears, right? Go Bears.
Go Bears.
And that's right, go Bears. So thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Putzu.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Absolutely.
Finally made it. It's taken a while.
Absolutely. So I'm really excited. This is the first. I doubt that it will be the only episode that we're having Dr. Putzu on the show. His dissertation was on a Jewish drinking topic. It was on wine, correct?
Correct. My dissertation was on the use of wine as a symbol and as a component of mystical techniques in particularly in medieval and early modern Kabbalah, with a focus on...
Wow, so 16th century Kabbalistic wine symbol. That's awesome. And that's not the only thing you've written, right? You have some articles out there.
Right, I have a couple of articles on the connection between wine and Olam Haba and the world to come in classic Kabbalah. And on the reception of that of those texts in Italy by Rabbi Menachem Azaria Fano in the early 17th century.
That's really awesome. Maybe a future topic for our conversation.
Right.
Yep.
And hopefully for a book soon.
Oh, that sounds exciting. In the meantime, and you have an Italian one, right? You have a separate Italian article?
Yes, that's one of those articles is in Italian because, well, that's my background.
Yeah. So I have to ask you, I'm very curious, how did you decide on that dissertation topic to do the research on wine and Kabbalah?
Well, thanks for asking. So I, with my dissertation, knowing that I would have to spend sweat and tears and many, many years on that, I decided to pick something that I was very interested in. And at the time, and to some extent still now, on the one hand, my main academic interest was Kabbalah. And on the other hand, again, as a son of a wine region in Italy of Piedmont, where some of the best reds in the world are made, I had a passion for and a background in wine tasting, especially. And so I said, well, why can't I put those two things together and write a dissertation about it? And it turned out to be the case that nobody else had done it. And so it was a fairly original topic to work with.
That's amazing. What else had there been about wine and Kabbalistic sources before your dissertation came on the scene?
Really, to be honest, not much. At the time, there was one encyclopedia entry on wine that also covered Kabbalah in Italian. There were some very scant references. There's like a footnote in a book on food and Kabbalah in English. To be very honest, not much more than that.
Do you want to speculate as to why there's such a dearth of literature or research? It's not like wine. Part of my question is, it's not like wine is an obscure topic, right? It's there. It's not uncomfortable. It's not awkward. It's not anxious, right? So do you have any speculation?
And people had written about wine quite a bit, for example, in the Bible, for example, in rabbinic literature, to some extent in post-Talmudic halachic literature, just not so much in Kabbalistic literature and thought. I am not sure why. You could say maybe it's because the academic field of Jewish mysticism is a little newer than, say, rabbinics or Bible. Maybe just because people were interested in maybe more general topics or other kind of things. I don't know.
All right.
I'm not sure, but I'm glad that not very many people wrote about that before me, so I could do it freely.
It's a fertile field for you. It's wide open. Wide open. So
Right.
how often, so let's, moving into it, how much is wine discussed in Kabbalistic literature? It's not just a few references, right? There's probably a fair amount of material there.
Right. So it is discussed mainly, I would say, in two ways. Okay. So a lot of Kabbalistic literature, as many people know, has to do with Tamei Mitzvot, has to do with the meaning of the commandments, giving a new spiritual meaning to the performance of actions that Jews are commanded, right? And so in Kabbalah in general, those actions, the deeds that humans are supposed to perform, are understood and as having an impact on the divine world, right? Kabbalists believe that the filigree of reality is suffused with a structure of 10 divine powers or 10 divine attributes called Sephirot. And those Sephirot, because of the exile, because of all sorts of metaphysical and historical issues, tend to be in a state of imbalance and disharmony. And so the job of humans is to with their actions, with the performance of the commandments, and with their ethical actions, are supposed to bring about balance and harmony in those different aspects of God. This is usually the language is usually used is that of ichud, of unification. You're with your action, you're supposed to make God one again, in a sense, or to bring about that harmony. So, to give you an example, the idea is, for example, that by drinking the 4 cups of wine at the Passover Seder, one is bringing together, unifying two different two different aspects of God, two different sfirot, mainly the aspect of mercy and love, chesed, on the one hand, with the aspect of might and power, which is gvura. And so, for example, by drinking white wine and red wine, those two aspects are harmonized together. So that is typically the kind of the narrative behind many of the mitzvot as understood with Kabbalistic lenses. Now, the related aspect, which is the other way in which wine enters and permeates Kabbalistic writing, is the association of wine with a particular, or sometimes more than a particular sphira, more than one particular, again, attribute of God, one particular aspect of divine rule over the universe. And I know that in your previous conversation with Rabbi Rubin from Chabad, he mentioned that wine, according to most Hasidic thought, is identified with the Sphira Binah, the third Sphira, which is a certain intellectual almost attribute of God, the Sphira of understanding. Now, that is certainly something that comes from certain Kabbalistic sources already in the Middle Ages. But one thing that is interesting to note is that the most just quantitatively frequent association of wine is not with that third sphira, but is with the fifth one, which is again gvura, might or power. Which is also a left side feminine sphira. So you have a number of association that are to some extent sinister and definitely feminine, and sometimes also a third sphira that is often associated with wine is then Malchut, or the Shekhinah, the divine presence. So these have all in common the fact that, in a sense, they descend from one another. They're all associated with feminine aspects of God, and you get there as probably you've touched in conversations with my friend and colleague Professor Rosenblum, the idea that oftentimes the wine becomes a metaphor or a symbol for dealings with women.
Oh, really?
Dealings with women, sometimes with dealing with non-Jews. It becomes very often a symbol, and that is true in Kabbalistic literature as well, for the other, whoever is different from the the Jewish male that is the author of the literature that we're talking about. In that sense, wine takes on this symbolic value and is really associated with the divine power to some extent to discipline and to discipline and punish with a certain amount of ambivalence. And this is built upon a very simple concept, right? Which is to say, well, anyone who's ever drank wine knows that a certain amount of wine, a small amount of wine, can bring about a lot of joy, can enhance our ability to socialize and to be merry, and we are in fact commended to drinking for holidays and celebrations and weddings and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, a little too much becomes a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Right, because its effect could be that sort of loosening our grips on our behavior, on our morality, and the possibility of sliding into sinful action. Right? So Kabbalists build upon this ambivalence that comes with wine, the idea that it is at the same time it can be the bearer of much joy and the bearer of much sin, of much sadness. And because of that, as I was saying, the main association is with that one sphira, gvura, that attribute, that aspect of God, which is the one that whose excess, according to most medieval Kabbalah, explains the existence of evil in the world. An excess of divine judgment, an excess of divine might can result in something that's harsh. And because of that, as I said, wine serves as a perfect symbol for the idea that there has to be a balance between, again, the merciful and the harsh or the powerful attributes of God. And if that doesn't happen, then the powerful aspect prevails. That's when we start having problems, right? And so in the same way, a certain amount of wine contributes to that balance, but then too much brings about problems.
Yeah. Why is there such a huge focus on balance? Is it for the unification stuff? Like what?
Yes.
What's sort of the broader impetus for the desire need for balance?
I think the way I understand is that the Kabbalists just were diagnosing their own situation as Jews in medieval Europe, right?
Where were they exactly? Where were they?
When we're talking about the earliest expressions of Kabbalistic literature, well, they surfaced in southwestern France and Spain, places like Provence and Catalonia and Castile. So the historical reality there, of course, is of Jewish communities that have been in those lands actually for several hundred years,
Uh-huh.
that are now
And they have plenty of wine too, right?
plenty of wine too. Absolutely, absolutely. But that is not something new, right? It's we have very famous winemakers, Jewish winemakers already in France, with best example being Rashi, of course, and all of that. Definitely plenty of wine, definitely wine drinking cultures,
Yeah.
right? The French one, the Spanish one, the Italian one, if you will, and frankly, even before that, the Palestinian one.
Where the Kabbalists end up, right? A lot of them, when the Spanish exile happens, or where do they go?
Yes, well, one of the phenomena that contributes to a sort of renaissance of Kabbalah in the mid-16th century is precisely the fact that Jews who had been living in Spain and the Iberian Peninsula for several hundred years are now forced either to convert or to leave. And of those who leave, some, a good number, take the opportunity to finally go back to the land of Israel that is now in Ottoman hands, and therefore is accessible once again to Jews after a long time. And that's how we then have what is called the Kabbalistic Renaissance in Spat, and we have these new communities, mainly Sephardim, that start writing commentaries on medieval Kabbalistic literature to develop new ideas, to emphasize certain aspects, and then from there, of course, with the arrival of the printing press, then their writings get disseminated back into Europe, North Africa, and so on and so forth.
So I have two questions. Is there any difference? So I started off asking you about balance. Is there any difference in the broad theme of balance before the exile and then after the exile from Spain? And the second question is there any difference about wine in the way that it's discussed before the exile from Spain versus afterwards?
So, I would say that part of this notion of balance, as I was trying to say, is born out of just the historical situation of Jews having lived, in as a minority community, as a minority religious community, in first Islamic dominated and then Christian dominated Spain and France.
Yeah.
With, as I said, the occasional persecution, and sometimes they become regular rather than occasional, and the inability, the inability to go back to the land of Israel. The idea that, well, the temple has been destroyed, and all of those things. So generally speaking, I mean, I think if you were looking at the world with Jewish eyes in the late Middle Ages, in places like Spain and France, well, you probably had some sort of perception that things were not going exactly as they should. The situation was not perfect.
Yeah.
And yet you believe that, you are a member of chosen people, and the one God is behind you. So clearly there's some sort of massive scale problem. And the way I think that problem is then construed or imagined by the Kabbalists is by saying, well, God's not in such a great shape either. And that is why we, the Jewish people, are not in such a great shape, and our word is not in such a great shape, right?
That's why for the balance, for the unification, to try to repair
And that is the idea that sort of there has been some sort of rupture, some sort of break in the structure of the divine. It had to do with exile, maybe. It had to do with initial sins of the patriarchs and so on and so forth. And that resulted in the current situation of the Jews. And we have some way to repair it. However, how do we do it? Well, through performing mitzvot and good deeds, essentially. Okay, so it's there's a whole kind of metaphysical projection, if you will, of what I think were historical and generally speaking existential situations. So that's before, if you will, that's before the Gerush Sfarad, the expulsions from Spain. Now, after the expulsion from Spain, of course, the idea of this exile and redemption, the idea of reunification, at least according to certain scholars, resonates even more with current events. And so the community of Tzfat, for example, sees themselves as a part of a sort of a messianic avant-garde, because their ability to return to the land of their forefathers, and to live as Jews again, right? Speaking about, considering the fact that a lot of the people who left the Iberian Peninsula and then eventually made it to the land of Israel had lived at least part of their existence as conversos, as Christians. And now they finally had the opportunity to go back to full practice of Judaism, really constituted an opportunity to for tikkun olam, for mending the word, in that sense. Now, the other question that you had was about treatment of wine. Yes.
And was there a difference in the way of thinking in Kabbalistic sources pre-exile from Spain versus afterwards? Or was it fairly continuous?
In many ways, Kabbalistic sources on, post-expulsion, kind of build, develop, and to some extent systematize. For example, in the work of Cordovero, try to systematize hints and various perhaps less developed thoughts and speculation about wine that you have in Kabbalistic sources before.
He was 16th century, right?
Yes.
Tzfat? Okay.
Yes. Tzfat is roughly mid-16th century, right? Same time, same environment of Joseph Caro, Isaac Luria, Moses Cordovero, and so on and so forth. Different authors deal with or emphasize different aspects of wine, and in doing that, to the extent again that wine has all of the symbolic value in their writing, they betray different attitudes about the word, about non-Jews, about women, about larger issues. And so I tend to think that, for example, Cordovero really emphasizes with the tremendous import that he attributes to the ability of these returning Jews, if you will, to now drink kosher wine and avoid, the wine of the Gentiles, yain nesek. He emphasized really the tremendous impact that practice of avoiding now the wine of Gentiles and drinking only kosher wine and so on and so forth, the tremendous positive impact that has of securing for you a spot in the Olam Haba, for example. So he emphasizes again the possibilities right there. Now, Luria, or rather his main disciple Chaim Vital, seems to me to emphasize more of the negative aspect, which is to say the idea that yes, we have to use wine in ritual, but the whole purpose of the ritual, the whole purpose of, for example, saying Kiddush, is to tame the sinful potential of drinking wine.
Oh wow!
Right?
It's like a mini concession.
Well, you have to do it.
Yeah.
You have to do it, but oftentimes my at least in my analysis of Vital's writings, you never see first of all anything positive that he has to say about so to speak secular drinking. Drinking at a table or something like that. So wine is confined exclusively to the mandatory rituals where wine is required.
Yeah.
And the goal of the ritual, the purpose of the ritual there seems to be always to say, well, wine is the gvura, wine is the dangerous element, is the element that is potentially damaging to divine harmony, and the blessing is that which diminishes, that balances out, that mellows down that dangerous potential. Oftentimes, that sort of concept is expressed by the fact that wine has to be mixed with water.
Yeah.
Right? Which is also a way of saying, the kind of to the extent that water is the symbol for another aspect of God, the mercifulness, the chesed. Then water balances out the inherent dangerousness of wine. So I think that the interesting thing is that we have two thinkers, two Kabbalists that base their speculation essentially on the same body of sources, the Zohar and other classic of medieval Spanish Kabbalah, but they take different aspects of it and they emphasize, I think, different potentialities that are within this wine symbolism. As I try to say, wine as a symbol is inherently ambivalent, right?
Wow.
But then certain thinkers emphasize more of the positive side and the joyful, the festive, all of that, and others tend to emphasize more the dangerousness, I think, potential of it.
And does that play into what you were talking about, the other, whether it was women, whether it was Gentiles, does that play into it, sort of the danger? Yeah.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. How do you deal then? You deal with wine to say one of my thesis is to suggest that in fact the way in which Kabbalists talk about wine betrays what they thought their attitudes were non-Jews, women, other things as well. That's what I call my Kabbalistic enology, my so to speak, an anthropology of Jewish wine, if you want to call it that way.
That's clever. That's clever. Have you applied it or seen anybody else apply that anthropology of Jewish?
Well, that's what I try to do with my work for sure, right? And the initial article that I mentioned is one where I'm trying to show that the way in which certain authors, not just Kabbalists, by the way, but mainly medieval and early modern Kabbalists, talk about wine in connection with the Olam Haba, then betrays a certain attitude toward our word, the word diholamase, right? By describing the relationship of wine, or the presence and the nature of wine in the word to come, they betray their thoughts about the state of the word in which they live.
Wow, that's great. Did anything in your research, did anything surprise you? Any shocking things regarding wine in Kabbalah?
One of the there's several things that I think are kind of interesting and cute, but since you've already talked about wine in Hasidism, one of the things that maybe surprised me a little is the fact that it is not until, to the best of my knowledge, and again, I've only surveyed, so to speak, kind of classical texts in Kabbalah, so I'm ready to find the exception to whatever I'm gonna try to suggest. Yeah. Is that it is not up until Hasidism that you find people using or Kabbalists using wine as a component of a so-called mystical technique. The idea that that kind of mild intoxication or whatever could bring about a state of consciousness that is conducive to the divine. The idea that there can be such a thing as a sort of a you can achieve some sort of kind of divine intoxication or something like that. That really doesn't seem to show up very often. Now, you do have wine in a lot of magical or medical recipes, like for healing. But the idea that you could use wine again to achieve a state of consciousness that would bring you closer to God, that is really not something that I've seen up until some early Hasidic sources.
Wow.
When you see something that goes into that direction, my contention is that Kabbalists are not really talking about real wine. They're not talking about real drinking. They're using wine as a metaphor for something else. Often that metaphor, it's a metaphor for Torah. And so the Zohar has some famous passages, for example, that that suggest, and Yosef Karo also builds on that, on the idea that if you want to approach God, you should not fill yourself with wine, with real wine. You should fill yourself with the wine of Torah, because just like wine, yain has 70 faces, right? Wine, in the numerical value of the term yain, is 70. So too Torah has 70 faces. So you have that connection right there between wine and Torah. And so you have, in a sense, to trade real wine for the wine of Torah.
Gotcha. Wow.
And so when my personal reading of sources such as, again, in the Zohar or in Joseph Caro Magid Mesharim, his kind of mystical autobiography, is that in fact almost like an ascetic attitude of saying, no, let's substitute Torah for real wine.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Putzu, for spending the time sharing your wisdom and knowledge on wine in Kabbalah. And so thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to it sounds like there's so much you've done research-wise, dissertation, and more. And hopefully we can have you on again.
Sure, that would be my pleasure. Awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, L'chaim.
L'chaim.